Hello, I'm Martin Cothran with Memoria College, and I'm here once again with Dr. Dan Sheffler, who's a professor at Memoria College. And we're talking today about the story, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And I think this is a fascinating book on so many levels. Oscar Wilde is a fascinating writer in his own right, and in so many ways, this seems to me, and we'll, I think, see this as we go through this, how the book reflects and yet does not reflect him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's start out by just talking about why is this book worth reading? This was written. I can't even actually remember the date. Roughly turn of the century, maybe a little earlier. And it's old. So why are we reading this?
Because it's beautiful and it's really well worth the time. It's the writing, I think, apart from all the philosophy and ideas that we're going to get into here, just the writing is so good. You can almost open to any random page and read a few sentences, and it is consistently some of the best writing that I've encountered.
It's also got a great message.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. Contrary to maybe popular belief that this is an immoral book, the Oscar Wilde himself said the trouble with it is that it's in fact so terribly moral, mm-hmm. and it does have a very strong moral in the end, as we're going to get into.
Yeah, and it comes from someone who was famous in his own day for not being terribly moral.
Right. In fact, put on trial for his immorality, famously in a public display. Yeah.
So he's a little bit of a paradox. So what is this story about? Just the rough outline. So if one of our listeners has never read it, they can at least know, generally speaking, what we're talking about.
Well, there's a main character, Dorian Gray, not surprisingly, who is a young, innocent, extremely good-looking young man. And the painter, Basil Howard, paints a portrait of Dorian Gray that captures that youthful innocence. And in that pivotal scene where this portrait is being painted, their friend, Lord Henry, gives this speech in praise of youth and beauty. And this makes Dorian Gray long to always be young and always be innocent. And he prays, not really a prayer to God, but just this kind of cry of the heart that the painting would age in place of him. And magically, his request, his wish is granted. And he doesn't realize it at the time, but little by little, as he goes, it's the painting that ages and takes on defects, while his outward appearance remains unchanged. However, it's more than just physical age, because it's also the sins that he commits leave marks on the painting. Magically, it's the painting that ends up with bloody hands. It's the painting that ends up with a cruel expression fixed in the face, while Dorian Gray, outwardly anyway, maintains, again, kind of magically, this look of youthful innocence. However, that spell does not protect Dorian Gray's soul. And the story is about the slow corruption of Dorian Gray's soul over time, because he can get away with anything. Mm-hmm. He can get away with murder, in fact. And because it doesn't leave any outward evidence, but it does mark his soul. And it's about the disaster that comes from not having to live with the consequences of your actions.
Why does this sound so much like a Twilight Zone episode?
It is kind of a Twilight Zone episode. This is a Victorian era Twilight Zone episode, yes.
Well, speaking of the Victorian era, there is a setting here, right? The kind of society we have at this time. What is is society like here? What period of history is he living in? Is this being written in?
Well, so we're talking about the second half of the 19th century in London, and this is the whole story takes place amongst the extreme upper class aristocrats who have maybe a lot more money than sense, we might say. And so we live during a period that simultaneously, I mean, when people say Victorian, right, they think of Victorian morality and kind of a very high standard of social peer pressure to do the conventional thing. However, especially amongst the upper classes here, there's not a lot of real morality underneath. And there's a strong element of surface veneer. In America, we call this same period the Gilded Age, right? Because it's all about these kinds of outward shows of wealth and class and maybe conventional morality. But there's something has become rotten at the core.
Right, and this is being discussed in literature like this. I remember some debate years ago in which I think I was involved. And the issue was about censorship, and people always appeal to the Victorian, because censorship is bad for the free expression of ideas, and presumably therefore bad for literature. Well, the Victorian period was, there were these certain ideals and strictures, sort of most of which were voluntary, not necessarily enforced by any sort of institutional agency, but. And yet the Victorian period was one of the great periods of literature.
So that's fair.
It seems sort of paradoxical, right? And there are things being discussed in this story. I mean, it does take place mostly, but then there are scenes that take place a little bit outside of that, showing what Dorian Gray is doing with himself, and these take place in other areas of London, for example, than necessarily the upper class area, But we have this opening scene, which you mentioned, and he's probably the most important scene in the book, because this is, I think, where all of the themes get laid down. Tell me what's going on here in this opening scene. There's several characters. Who are they? What's happening?
Well, throughout, there's really three central characters, and then there are a number of other side characters that play come in to play certain plot roles. But we really have three people here. We've got Dorian Gray that we've already talked about, who at this point is young, innocent, doesn't really know what he believes. And then you have these two older friends, Lord Henry and Basil Howard.
Yeah, and on Lord Henry, he's Basil Hallward, the painter, sort of taunts him a little bit in this beginning scene, and he points out that Sir Henry lives outwardly a very virtuous life. He doesn't seem to buy into all the philosophies, or take them at least to their logical conclusions. And yet, says Howard, yet you never say a moral thing. you
right.
This apparently moral, but you never say. And then he accuses Henry of using his cynicism as a pose.
Right. So the character of Lord Henry is really kind of the driving force behind the novel as a whole. He has this habit of very elegantly and poetically saying outrageously immoral things and challenging every established norm and idea out there. But he says it for effect. And you can tell throughout he likes that witty turn of phrase in conversation where he says something shocking. He says it cleverly.
Yeah, he likes posing as a revolutionary, even though he's not himself in his own
He doesn't do any
behavior.
of it.
Yes, right.
But he gets a kick out of, in conversation, posing as this extreme cynic, extreme aesthete, extreme libertine, and he loves paradoxes. This book is full of paradoxical expressions.
And some of them are, if I think I mentioned to you, this is my most marked book in terms of quotations that I've marked in there. And it's just filled with Lord Henry's, wit and wisdom, so to speak. And some of them are quite patently true, but about at least half of them are challenging some kind of common belief and turning it upside down and making you think that that the opposite of what we commonly believe is true. Now, Chesterton does this too, but Chesterton's are aimed at truth, whereas
I like that. Yeah,
I think Lord
Chesterton
Henry's,
as the inverted Lord Henry.
Yeah, well, that's a good.
Lord Henry as the inverted Chesterton. Perhaps.
Right. Yeah. Whereas Lord Henry seemed to be aimed at sort of their shock value, or just the surface shock value of what he's saying. But if you go deeper, they really don't play out. And aren't we living in sort of a time now where we have a whole lot of Lord Henrys?
We have very
They're
many
posing
Lord
as
Henrys.
revolutionaries.
Yes. And I think that this is one reason why I think this book is worth a read today, because we live in the age of clever witticisms on Twitter that are completely disconnected from having to live out the consequences of actually believing those things. And that's part and parcel of our whole digital discourse these days.
Right, and there's some discussion in here of masks, and isn't that what Twitter does? Allows us to wear a mask, and say outrageous things, which we
but then not have to answer,
for them, and not even necessarily do them ourselves, but rah. We pose as if we want other people to do them. What about Basil Hallward, the painter?
Well, so Basil is in contrast to Lord Henry. Basil's the true believer. He's an artist, something of a great artist. It's implied, who has really identified something truly good and beautiful in Dorian Gray. And Dorian Gray and his innocent, youthful features have become a kind of muse for Basil Hallward. And so he's pouring all of himself into this painting to create something that's truly beautiful. And he begs Lord Henry, don't corrupt Dorian. Don't say your poisonous witticisms, and the implication is, Basil himself is intelligent and mature enough, and he's old college buddies with Lord Henry. He has the maturity and the wisdom to kind of take everything that Lord Henry says with a grain of salt, but he knows that Dorian Gray won't. That there's a real possibility that Lord Henry's witticisms will be taken quite seriously and quite literally by this innocent young man. And because Basil really does believe in the objectivity of goodness and beauty, he does not want that innocence to be ruined. And I don't know how much we should spoil. It's that concern that ends up coming back around later on in the story.
Yes. So Lord Henry says in one part of the scene where he starts articulating what it is he believes, I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic ideal, to something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal it may be. What does this tell us about where Lord Henry is going with this philosophy of his?
Yes, this reminds me a lot of Nietzsche, actually, which I don't know that there was any direct influence, but it certainly is of the same time. This idea that the right way to live is to be life affirming, and to not deny yourself anything, that our instincts and our impulses are all naturally good, and that the limitations of that life is this artificial, external slave morality that Christianity has imposed on us that gives us all these guilt complexes. Reminds me of Freud, which we talked about with the Reef book. Reminds me of Rousseau. And so you have all of this is a common thread behind a lot of the progressivist philosophies that want to say we should take away all the moral restrictions and just live, just experience, just have it all.